In today's video, I'll be performing a full restoration of this vintage JB Van Shiver wall unit. From fixing worn out surfaces and screw holes to tackling a DIY relocated shelf, I'll walk you through every step using a variety of tools and techniques, showing exactly how I took this very tired piece of vintage furniture and brought it back to its former glory. This was a very complex restoration and even had a couple surprises along the way, but each was solved as they popped up, and I'm really excited to show you how this one was transformed. Before we dive into the restoration, let's go over some of the issues the piece has. To start, as you'd expect with a piece of this age, the original finish was in poor shape. It was visibly faded, with a notable amount of wear around high-touch areas like the door handle. And within the bar cabinet, it appeared something had been spilled and eroded the finish and potentially stained the wood. The most notable issue, though, was somebody's DIY change. There should be a shelf in this area, but somebody cut that out and retrofitted it upwards. This change left exposed mortises where the shelf should have been. In addition, there was exposed screw holes and scratches, which are likely remnants of other work that was done. Clearly this piece had a bit of a checkered past, but thankfully it landed in my hand and I'll be able to give it the help that it deserves. With arguably any restoration, the first step is to break the piece down. To start this process, I wanted to get the legs off first, so I tipped the piece over onto some of those foam workout mats to avoid any further damage. This allowed me to gain access to the nuts that are holding the legs in place. With the legs removed, I needed to get the piece upright again to continue work. In my head, this was going to look really smooth where I'd push the piece up in a single motion and all would be perfect. It didn't quite work out like that. Apparently my geometry skills are a little bit rusty, so in the end I had to use a little bit of brute force. With the piece standing upright, I was able to move on to removing the doors. Next, I removed the drawers to get them out of the way. And lastly, removed the bar cabinet door. The hinges were very dirty and grimy, so I wanted to get them soaking in some white vinegar while I worked on the rest of the piece. I let them soak for a couple of days and then clean them right before reassembling, and the dirt comes right off. I'll show you that process later in the video. With the piece disassembled, it was time to turn my attention to this retrofitted shelf. I put a clamp in place to keep the shelf from falling down while I removed the pocket screws below. With the screws removed, the shelf came right out. The shelf should have been here, and I thought about reattaching it, but there was a big problem. The tendons had been cut off and the edges were extremely jagged. It just would have been more time intensive to try to save this than put a new shelf in. Before I did that though, I wanted to apply filler to any of the voids that the piece had. There were plenty of areas that required filler, including the old screw holes, some of these linear scratches, and other areas with vintage wear. There was also this notable veneer chip that probably occurred when they were tearing out the shelf. To fix, I used a razor to lift the chip and then injected glue behind it with a syringe. I like to be very generous with the glue application as I want to make sure that the entire surface is coated. I used some scrap boards to clamp this up due to the awkward location of the chip. A typical clamp wouldn't have enough reach to get pressure exactly where I needed it. So I used a smaller piece of scrap plywood to concentrate the pressure exactly where I needed it. 24 hours later, I came back and removed the clamps. The chip was now securely glued down, but there was still a void present, so I applied wood filler. Besides the missing shelf, there also used to be a partition in this area. The cut wasn't very clean, so I needed to fix this up. The exposed mortise definitely needed to be filled, so I mixed up some 2-part epoxy putty. To use, you just cut a piece to size and then mix it together in your hands to start the chemical reaction. To make the repair concealment easier later in the process, I like to tint the epoxy with brown. It's much easier to hide a brown fill than it is a stark white. Once the epoxy putty has been mixed to a uniform consistency, I push it into the voids. Once the epoxy putty was dry, I came back with a router and a flush trim bit to clean up the edge. This joint was looking much better and now was flush. Before working on the new shelf, I needed to make sure the left side could be opened up to have enough clearance to slide the new shelf into the existing mortises. The top was held together with pocket screws, and I held my breath that there wasn't also glue in the joint. With the screws removed, it was the moment of truth. Bingo, we're in business. I could then start to make the new shelf. In theory, creating a shelf is pretty straightforward, but in this case it's going to be a little more complex as I have to do tenon joinery and veneer it. Once the piece was cut to size, I started filling the voids with wood filler. I'll be adding veneer later in the process, and I need the surface to be perfectly flat. I'm using a water-based wood filler that dries via evaporation, so to speed things up I got out my heat gun. Once the wood filler was dried, it was time to sand it down. Here I'm using 220 grit sandpaper to create a buttery smooth surface. The next step is to seal the surface. Here I'm using de-wax shellac as it dries incredibly fast and it's easy to sand. The last step to prepare the surface for veneer is a quick sanding with 400 grit sandpaper to knock down any imperfections. To hold the piece in place while I'm working on it, I applied two-sided tape. I use two-sided tape a lot as it comes in handy. It's great in situations like this where you need to work on the surface and don't want to use clamps as they'd obstruct the working area. I had a piece of PSA walnut veneer left over from another project, so I'll be using it here. PSA stands for pressure sensitive adhesive, and it's as simple as peeling off the backing and sticking the veneer on. PSA veneer is a bit more expensive than other types, but I believe it easily makes up for that with its ease of installation and efficiency. I use a scrap piece of plywood with a rounded over edge to exert additional force and firmly set the veneer. To trim the edges, I used a router with a flush trim bit. In my opinion, this is the easiest way to trim veneer. After trimming, I gave the edges a quick sanding to make sure they were nice and smooth. The next step in the process is to cover the plywood edges with edge banding. It's straightforward to install. You just cut your pieces a little bit bigger than you need and then iron them on. The heat from the iron melts the glue, creating the adhesion. The last step in the installation process is to trim away the excess using a razor blade. Edge banding is sold oversized so that you can come back and trim it perfectly flush during this step. This is a very slow and tedious process, but thankfully I'm only working on a single board rather than edge banding an entire piece of furniture. I think I was a little nervous trimming the top as I was not as impressive as I normally am. Watch as I flip this over, I do a much better job trimming the bottom. And of course, another round of sanding with 220 grit. It was now time to work on the tenon joinery. I didn't have enough rip capacity to do this in the traditional manner with the fence to my right, so I had to set it up to the left and set up a sacrificial fence to keep my saw blade from causing any damage. I slid the fence over between cuts to slowly create the tenons. In hindsight, I kind of wish I did this with a router, but this was the path I took. With the cuts complete, I came back with a chisel to remove any remaining material. And finally, a quick round of sanding just to remove any tooling marks and ensure a nice snug fit. The mortises on the piece didn't extend all the way to the edge of the shelf, so I needed to notch the tenons. And with that, the shelf fabrication process was over and I was ready to install it in the piece. I started the process by adding glue into all the joints and used a scrap piece of wood to ensure each joint was fully covered. I then slid the new shelf into the existing mortises and closed the joint on the top as well. Everything was going smoothly until I got viciously attacked by a clamp. Thankfully, the only real injury was to my pride. To wrap up this process, I reinstalled the pocket screws on the top and then added a couple clamps. This was a nice mini accomplishment in a very large project. It was good to see the piece start to take shape. After 24 hours, I came back and I removed the clamps. It was then time to move on to the next phase of the project, which was removing the old finish. Using chemical stripper, scraping, or sanding are all viable options to remove old finish. In this case, I knew the piece had an extremely thin coat of lacquer, which was also failing. Due to this, I decided to sand off the original finish, as there really wasn't much to remove. This piece, however, was veneer, so I did have to take care not to oversand and burn through it. This part of the process took forever. Mostly due to the piece's size and configuration, there was just so many surfaces that needed finish removed. I used 120 grit to remove the old finish and then worked my way up to 220 in preparation for finishing. To sand tight areas or curves, I used the original sander, my hands, to make that happen. After many hours, I was able to get this piece back to its raw form. I did make one boo-boo though, but thankfully I know somebody who can fix it. I also found a couple areas where the veneer was loose during the sanding process, so I doubled back with a glue syringe and glued those back down. These are just cosmetic repairs, so using some blue painter's tape to hold it down while the glue dries works perfectly fine. After a couple hours, once the glue is dry, the tape can be removed and the repair can be sanded down. If all goes well, it'll be completely invisible. With the repairs and finish removed, I was now looking at the next set of problems. The base and the handles were constructed of elm, which is significantly lighter than walnut. To achieve a cohesive result, I'm going to have to use some color magic to make these woods blend together. The other problem the finish removal revealed was the staining within the bar cabinet. This will take some special care to hide. I also found this nice scratch on the side, which is also going to need to be hidden, and of course, I have to fix my own mistake from before. When it comes to finishing pieces, I like to base the finish schedule on the piece itself. In this case, I have a piece with a lot of repairs and color variation. So I want to apply an oil-based stain to help conceal those repairs and also start to blend the color together. As you can see in the video, the elm handles start to blend a little bit better with the walnut as the stain is applied. It's certainly not perfect and there's still a bit of contrast, but it's a good first step in a multi-step color process. Really what I'm looking for here is just for the stain to provide that initial shift in color. I'll fine-tune the color later, but having a good base makes the process a little bit easier. Here's what the piece looked like after staining. The next step is to do the color touch-ups. This is the magical part of the process that conceals the repairs. For this, I use a combination of graining pens, blendalls, powder stains, and de-wax shellac. Each repair is unique and requires a unique approach. In this situation here, we have a light burn through on the edge, so I'm applying Harvest Brown Blendall. After rubbing it on, you can use your finger to feather it out. I like to add a little bit of powder stain, in this case light walnut, to build depth in the repair, and then seal it in with de-wax shellac. While the shellac is wet, I like to feather it out with my finger to further conceal. Finally, I added a couple grain marks with a graining pen to finish this repair. Now for the bar cabinet, I used a different approach as it had a splotchy stain that I had to cover. In this situation, I layered on powder stains in light walnut, medium walnut, and burnt umber, trying to imitate the surrounding grain. Between each layer, I sprayed on a little bit of shellac to lock it in. With repairs like this, due to all the variables, there's a lot of trial and error involved. I'm continually changing the colors applied based on what I'm seeing. And here's the final result. It's definitely not fully concealed, but it's hidden enough that somebody's eye won't be drawn to it. The scratch on the side, again, took a different approach. In this case, I used graining pens and powder stains to connect the surrounding grain lines. With repairs like this, I find it's easier to slowly build the color than try to apply a lot at once. And of course, I had to fix the issue I created by burning through this edge banding. I apologize, I forgot to hit the record button. For this repair, I used a Harvest Brown Blendall and light walnut and burnt umber powder stains. This part of the process takes a bit, as I have to go around the piece and, on a case-by-case basis, conceal the prior repairs that were made. Usually as I go along, the process gets a little easier though, because I find the right combination of colors to get me the look I need. Now this large linear scratch was a huge point of frustration for me. It's almost impossible in my opinion to hide large scratches that run perpendicular to the grain. The best case scenario here is just to conceal it enough so the eye isn't drawn to it. It's very unlikely that you'll make it fully disappear. Now if you're sitting there thinking, wow, that doesn't look very good, you're absolutely right, it doesn't. But thankfully later in the process, I can apply a heavy coated toner to conceal this even more. The magic of restoration is it doesn't all happen in one step, rather it's multiple steps that create the result. The piece was starting to take shape, but there was still too much contrast for my liking. To help bring the colors closer together, the next step was to apply toner. I make my own toner mixing together de-wax shellac, denatured alcohol, and dyes, and I always have a batch of my favorite color on hand. There's a link in the description below to these products as well as detailed mixing instructions. Toner is a clear finish with color added, which is sprayed on the piece and can be used to fine-tune the overall look. Because it's sprayed, you can layer color on the entire piece or just certain areas to build color exactly how you need it. Unlike with stain, when you wipe it on, there's only so much color the wood will accept. This piece, I applied a single coat of toner to the entire thing just to help even out the color, and it also helps to build depth in the finish. The key with toner is to apply very light coats and slowly creep up on the color that you want. I was happy with the color of the walnut after one toner coat, but wasn't loving the color of the elm on the handles, edge of the case, or on the base. So the next step was to spot tone these areas to further build color. I already had my gun loaded with toner, so I just had to add more dye to make it a stronger color. I then reduced the spray pattern on my gun as well as reduced the amount of fluid. The smaller the spray pattern, the less fluid you need to ensure good atomization. With my gun adjusted, I began spraying toner on the elm areas of the piece. I sprayed about 4 coats, and seeing it live, you barely can see the shift in color. However, if we compare one of these legs to an area that was not toned 4 times, the difference is much greater. I was very happy with the color at this point, so I just repeated the process on the other pieces that were constructed of elm, like the handles. You have to be careful when spot toning not to put too much color in one area, otherwise it can give you a splotchy result. When I'm doing this, I'll hold my gun farther away so I'm just misting on color to avoid creating lap marks. This technique definitely takes some practice, but if I can learn it, I fully believe anyone else can as well. With the toning process complete, the last step is to apply a top coat. Due to the nature of this piece, it'll probably see a bit more wear and tear, so I'm going to apply a polyurethane, which will be more durable than other options. I know water-based polyurethanes really do get a bad rap, but they've come a long way in recent years, and I'm a big fan of the general finishes in Duro-Poly. This is a much different product than some of those water-based polyurethanes you'll find at the big box stores. The Enduro-Poly is great as it sprays wonderfully and provides excellent clarity, leveling, and durability. For the record, I'm not sponsored in any way, shape, or form. I just really like this product. After each coat has dried, I like to sand with 400 grit sandpaper very gently just to knock down any imperfection. This helps ensure that the final coat is buttery smooth. I ended up applying 2 coats of polyurethane to this piece. I don't like to apply more than 2 coats of polyurethane as I like to keep the overall finish on the thinner side. Keep in mind that I have finished build already from the shellac that was used in the toning process. Polyurethane's main purpose is for durability. I wouldn't mind just using shellac, but it's not very durable, whereas polyurethane is extremely resistant to scratches and other chemical contaminants. The next step is to clean the hardware that's been sitting in vinegar for several days. These hinges were covered in dirt and grime as well as toner lacquer as the piece was assembled and finished while these were installed. I used Brasso and 4-0 steel wool to polish the hinges. If they've been sitting in vinegar long enough, the dirt and grime will come right off. The finish line was now in sight. The last step is just to put the piece back together. I started by reinstalling the cabinet doors. Put the drawers back in their rightful place. And then finally screwed on the drop-down bar cabinet door. And with that, this restoration was now complete. This was a long journey, so here's a quick refresher of what the piece looked like before we got started. And here's the final result, a fully restored freestanding wall unit ready for another lifetime of use. This was a very complex restoration, and one of the hardest parts is getting a nice even color on this one. Personally, I'm very happy with how uniform the color is on this piece, but I'm a bit biased. And let's not forget all the work that went into fixing this shelf and concealing the damage around it. And here's what it looks like now. You can still see the repair ever so slightly, but the color touch-ups and toner really did a good job of concealment. Using the steps I showed you prior, we were able to really hide this damage and also blend in the shelf, and it looks like it's always been there. If you've enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that thumbs up and subscribe for more restoration projects. Let me know in the comments below if you like the new look or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Till next time.